Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dimpna Clerkin, and I am the Training and Information Manager with the Housing Agency. So thanks so much for joining us for the very first session in our new Housing Essentials learning series. A vital part of the Housing Agency's role is to support housing professionals as a community of practice and develop capacity in the system. And one of the ways we do this is through training events such as these. We're also excited to let you know that our apprenticeship programme is due to commence this October, subject to final QQI validation. So this new social and affordable housing apprenticeship is a major initiative developed with the sector over the past 4 years. It's a 2-year earn and learn programme for aspiring housing officers, and we're currently engaging AHBs and local authorities to take on apprentices. We've had a good deal of interest so far from both learners and employers, and you can find out more information on the Ballsbridge College website, and we will put a link to that in our chat there. And if you're interested, just drop us a line at training@housingagency.ie. So back to today. The Housing Essentials is a new 5-part learning series aimed at anyone who's new to the housing sector, or really anyone who just wants a refresher on how housing in Ireland works, because as we know, it's very complex. From our most recent training needs survey, we discovered that a lot of people working in housing are fairly new to the sector. There's about 62% said they had less than 5 years experience. So we've designed these sessions to give a clear, practical overview of housing policy systems and day-to-day practice. Obviously, we won't be able to cover everything in each session, but we'll make sure to point you towards useful resources if you want to explore things further. So, just to quickly run through what's coming up next in the series. Next Wednesday, July 8th, we have social housing operations and supports. Then we'll take a little break for part of the summer, and we'll resume on the 9th of September. We will be looking at the Starter Homes programme. Then in October 15th, we will have the first part of Building Inclusive Communities, and that will cover age-friendly housing and Housing First. And then we will wrap this series with the second part of Building Inclusive Communities, and that will focus on housing for disabled people and traveller communities. And you can register for all of these and find the slides from today's session on our brand new Housing Agency website, just launched yesterday. And you'll find this information under our news and events section. And you'll also find the recording from today's session on our YouTube channel shortly. That might be up tomorrow. So we'll leave all the questions until the end of the session today, and we'll stop the recording before the questions and answers. If you have any questions that are related to today's presentation, type them into the chat as we go. And if you can say who the question is aimed at, that would be really helpful too. So on to today's session. We have 2 great speakers from the Housing Agency lined up. We have Kevin McFlynn, our legal advisor, who will look at housing legislation in Ireland. And then Hayley Curran, our policy officer, will look at housing policy in Ireland and key organisations in the Irish housing system. Our first speaker today, Kevin McFlynn, is a qualified solicitor currently acting as in-house counsel with the Housing Agency. Kevin joined the agency in 2023 after multiple years' experience working in the residential property team of a large Dublin-based commercial law firm. Today, Kevin will give us an overview of the essentials of housing legislation in Ireland. So take it away, Kevin.
That's great. Thanks very much, Stefan. As you can appreciate, there's a lot of housing legislation in Ireland. It's a colossal topic, and I suppose with each government, with each policy that's introduced, acts have to be introduced, they have to be amended. So I suppose the purpose of today is to sort of give you a very high-level overview of the main pieces of legislation in the state, and with a particular focus on the more recent reforms that have come about. So the first you'll see there, the orange tab, is the Housing Act of 1966. So this was really the foundational legislative framework for Irish housing. It consolidated and modernised historical statutes to outline local authority responsibilities, state funding, compulsory land acquisition, and housing standards. And as amended, it remains central really to modern social housing and urban renewal. And it really does remain sort of the blueprint for all acts that have followed. The second piece of legislation we look at is the Housing Miscellaneous Provisions Acts of 1979 to 2014. So as I said, whilst the Housing Act of 1966 is effectively the blueprint, there have been many amendments made over the years. And these acts are essentially dynamically updated and fine-tuned to reflect the latest housing policies that are introduced. Of the intervening years have amended existing frameworks to reform social housing eligibility, local authority management, tenant purchase schemes, and also rental regulations. So I will come back to the 2009 Act there, the dark purple tab, shortly, but I want to just look at the Residential Tenancies Act 2004. So this is effectively the primary statutory framework that regulates the Irish private rental sector and student accommodation. It was originally established by the Rental Tenancies Act 2004 to balance tenant protections with landlord rights, and also to encompass a sort of a robust dispute resolution process. And the legislation has undergone major structural overhauls over the years, most notably the Residential Tenancies Miscellaneous Provisions Act of 2026 that was just introduced earlier this year, completely replaced the historical rent pressures in system with a new national rent control regime and mandatory 6-year rolling tenancies. And I'll circle back to those changes shortly. The next act is the Planning and Development Housing and Residential Tenancies Act 2016. So this was introduced and really is a pivotal piece of emergency legislation that was enacted to fast-track housing delivery under the government's Rebuilding Ireland Action Plan. Its defining feature was the temporary introduction of the strategic housing development process, which permitted developers to bypass local councils and apply directly to An Bord Pleanála for large-scale housing projects. It's important to note that the strategic housing development process has now been encapsulated on a permanent basis in the Planning and Development Amendment Large-Scale Residential Development Act of 2021. A very crucial act, and certainly an act in which the Housing Agency is deeply involved in, is the Affordable Housing Act of 2021. So this was really the first standalone piece of affordable housing legislation in the history of the Irish state. It enacted as a statutory engine behind the Housing for All plan, and it establishes the legal architectures for state-backed shared equity schemes, affordable local authority purchasing, and an entirely new state tenure known as cost rental, which I do understand will be delved into deeper in future episodes of the series. Also notably, it expanded the state's role beyond traditional social housing provision and empowers local authorities and, of course, the Land Development Agency, which has just been set up in recent years. The next one there is the Planning Development Act, and I thought I would sort of maybe delve deeper into this act as it really does have quite some scope. So I'll move across. So the Planning Development Act was enacted to modernise, to consolidate and to streamline Ireland's planning system. It formally repeals and replaces the foundational Planning and Development Act 2000. So, of course, a quarter of a century has passed and new structural planning reforms are needed, and therefore a new act really was essential at this point. It stands as the third largest piece of legislation in the history of the state. Anybody that has ever read through it will attest to that. It's really colossal. And it's designed to accelerate delivery for Housing for All and the National Development Plan. And it introduces major reforms to legal structures, policy hierarchies, as well as statutory timelines. So just looking at some of these pillars in greater detail. So you'll be aware that our planning body was the An Bord Pleanála. That has now been replaced by a commission. So this splits corporate oversight from actual planning consent decisions to stop internal backlogs, therefore making the process much more efficient. And it is also led by an independent CEO with no voting rights in planning approvals, which of course encourages then integrity as well. It extends local authority development plans from 6 years to 10 years for better project predictability. And it also mandates a comprehensive review at year 5 to ensure housing and infrastructure targets are met. And I suppose the goal there is that if a new development plan is introduced, let's say in 2025, that it doesn't simply run without being ever reviewed until 2035, that in 2030, it will be reviewed, it'll be monitored, and it'll be seen as to whether it's still fit for purpose. So that's a very welcome edition. And then just in terms of judicial review, the 8-week deadline is still retained, but crucially, you must now exhibit legal standing, which means that if you are making a complaint or a dispute against a planning application, you must be able to demonstrate that that planning application in some way will affect you, say for exceptional circumstances. And it's just to ensure that sort of planning applications aren't held up unnecessarily by perhaps people who have no connection with the application, holding it up due to complaints. And it also introduces a standardized means-tested legal cost model to prevent runaway litigation expenses. So essentially just to ensure costs don't unnecessarily spiral. So the Housing Miscellaneous Provisions Act of 2009, as I mentioned to you, the 1966 Act is really the blueprint, but it has been amended and updated over the years. The 2009 Act was really a significant piece of legislation in Ireland that addressed various aspects of housing policy. It includes provisions for the improvement of housing services, management of social housing, as well as the establishment of frameworks for housing authorities to operate effectively. And essentially, it was designed to enhance the quality and availability of housing for the population. So just looking at some of the reforms that were introduced under this Act, it introduced what are known as housing services plans. So the Act mandates housing authorities to prepare and implement housing services plans, which outline how they will meet housing needs in their areas. I think we'll all agree that nobody knows a local area more than the people in that area. So it's sort of devolving powers to the local authorities to develop housing plans that are absolutely necessary for their local communities. The Act provides for the allocation of social housing and establishes criteria for assessing housing needs, ensuring that vulnerable populations receive adequate support. The Act empowers the Minister for Housing to issue regulations and guidelines. And then the Act also includes provisions for addressing antisocial behaviour in housing contexts and allows for the development of strategies to manage such issues effectively. Funding and resources. The Act outlines funding mechanisms for housing services and the resources available to housing authorities to fulfil their obligations. It would be remiss of me not to mention something quite topical at the moment, and that is the Housing and Residential Tenancies Miscellaneous Provisions Bill of 2026. This is a major amendment to the 2009 Act, which I just mentioned, and essentially it brought about many changes, but the one I want to look at, most notably this presentation, is that applicants for social housing supports must now demonstrate that they are lawfully resident, but moreover, that they are habitually resident in the state as well. So the purpose of this bill is really to provide clarity and consistency and to ensure applicants for social housing supports possess a long-term need to or long-term right to reside in Ireland and have established their centre of interest in the state. So obviously you must be able to demonstrate that you are lawfully resident in the state, but it goes deeper than that, that you have I suppose, a deep, meaningful connection to the state, that your job is here, your family is here, your home is here. So you must be able to demonstrate that in different ways. The bill also sets out the lawful residency criteria for each citizen type, and they're all listed there. And the bill also puts in place a new statutory appeals mechanism for the first time for local authority decisions relating to social housing eligibility and assessment in general. So, as I mentioned to you earlier, one of the major, I suppose, legislations in terms of the rental tenancies is the Residential Tenancies Act of 2004. That was really a notable piece of legislation that again has been sort of amended and revised over the years, most notably with the Residential Tenancies Miscellaneous Provisions Act of 2026. So the residential rent market reforms, so why were these brought about? So on the 10th of June 2025, the government approved new policies to strengthen rent controls and tenancy protections for new tenancies created from the 1st of March of 2026. The aims were essentially, number one, to protect tenants nationwide, to ensure all tenants benefited from rent protection, to restrict no-fault evictions, a no-fault eviction being that when a landlord ends a tenancy without the tenant having done anything wrong, that is not due to rent arrears, antisocial behaviour, or any other breach of the lease, to increase supply. It's well documented that Ireland does face a shortage of rental homes, especially apartments, and the reforms are essentially to encourage investment and development, which will encourage the building of new rental apartments and help slow down rent increases and moderate rent levels over time. And again, just to create a fair system, ultimately we're looking to balance tenant protections as well as landlord needs. So just looking at the scope of the reforms that were introduced in March 2026, The changes really were brought about threefold. So you have rent increases, changes were made, security of tenure, and then ending a tenancy. And security of tenure being a tenant's right to stay in rented accommodation for a set period of time. Where does this apply? Well, it applies to private rented housing. So that includes accommodation let under HAP and RAS. It applies to student-specific accommodation. It applies to approved housing body tenancies, and it also applies to cost rental tenancies. Notably, it does not apply to local authority tenancies, and it also does not apply where a renter shares the property with the owner. So, for example, if you are renting a room in the landlord's home, it wouldn't apply to that scenario. So just delving deeper into the rent increases. So rent can only be increased once per year by 2% or by inflation if that's lower. And the rate of inflation is measured by the Consumer Price Index, CPI. So just sort of separating new tenancies from old tenancies. For new tenancies, that is new tenancies from the 1st of March 2026, all landlords will be able to set rent at market rates. So when a new tenancy begins, but only if the last tenancy ended because the tenant left by choice, it breached obligations, or if the property no longer suits their needs, or alternatively at the end of a 6-year tenancy cycle. So they're the two grounds in which landlords will be able to set market rents. In terms of existing tenancies, that being tenancies that were in place prior to the 20th of February 26, rent increases will continue to be capped at the rate of inflation according to CPI or 2%, whichever is lower. This will also apply nationwide, so it's no longer confined to certain urban centres under the old RPZ system. And from the 1st of March 2026, the 2% cap on annual rent increases will not apply to new developments of newly built apartments and student-specific accommodation. So the next set of changes really were in relation to security of tenure and ending a tenancy. So from the 1st of March 2026, all new tenancies will become what are known as tenancies of minimum duration. What is that? Well, a tenancy of minimum duration is effectively a cycle of 6 years. So when you first enter into the tenancy, considering that you passed the first 6 months and you haven't been served with a notice a notice of termination, your tenancy will automatically become what is known as a TMD. That is, that it will be renewed every 6 years on 6-year cycles. So if a tenancy is created on or after the 1st of March, it will automatically become a TMD when a tenant, as I said, has rented the accommodation for those 6 months without getting a valid notice of termination. One of the major reforms that were brought in under this act earlier this year was, for the first time, there is a distinction that is made between small landlords and large landlords. I think we're all aware of large corporate landlords, and I think there was just a pressing need that they have to be treated differently from your smaller landlords that perhaps own 1, 2, or 3 properties. So effectively, the distinction is small landlords have 3 or fewer tenancies, whilst large landlords have 4 or more tenancies. And essentially, the need there is to balance tenant security with property rights. So it used to be the case that a large landlord and a small landlord, I mean, they just were encapsulated under landlord, could end a tenancy for a multitude of reasons. Under the March 2026 rules, that has been dramatically decreased for both, but in particular for large landlords. So it's now the case that a large landlord, that is a landlord with 4 tenancies or more, can only end a tenancy for 2 specific reasons. Number 1, there's a breach of tenant obligations. And number 2, the property is no longer suitable for the tenant. So for example, the family perhaps has expanded and is no longer fit for purpose in that property. A small landlord can end a tenancy during the 6-year period if the tenant is not meeting obligations. For example, it's not paying rent, antisocial behaviour, etc. If the property is no longer suitable for the tenant, if the landlord is experiencing financial hardship, or if the landlord requires the property for themselves or an immediate family member. Alternatively, at the end of the 6-year cycle that I mentioned, small landlords can then end a tenancy for additional reasons. So if they intend to sell the property, if they are substantially refurbishing or renovating the property, they need the property for themselves or a family member to use, or they are changing the use of the property. And what I thought I'd do here is I would just sort of provide a table now. I probably won't get into it in much detail on this presentation, but I do believe these slides will be sent to you afterwards. And obviously the meeting is being recorded. So certainly have a review of that table and you can sort of see the differences that have been made over the course of the years. So you'll see the Part 4 tenancy which was a 6-year cycle, they will be expired in 2028. So that bottom rung will be deleted. And what you will then have is you will have tenancies of unlimited duration. That is tenancies from 2022 to the 20th of February 2026. And you'll then have tenancies of minimum duration, that being tenancies that were introduced under the 1st of March 2026 provisions that I mentioned. So that brings an end to my portion of the slide. I hope that was useful. It was a lot of information, but I'll pass you over to Dympna. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, Kevin. And sorry to interrupt your flow there, but your audio did improve, I think, a bit whenever you turned off the camera there. So now I'm delighted to introduce Hayley Curran. Hayley is currently the policy officer at the Housing Agency and has a 10-year career covering frontline homelessness services and housing policy and research. She has a master's in government, policy and politics and a diploma in housing studies from the IPA. Today, Hayley will take us further into the Housing Essentials Toolkit. She will unpack two important areas. First, an overview of housing policy in Ireland, and then a look at the key organisations within the Irish housing system. So take it away, Hayley.
Thanks for that introduction, Dympna, and to Kevin as well for that overview of housing legislation. I think that was helpful in setting the scene for housing policy in Ireland and understanding some of the legislation that it comes from. So for my part of the webinar, as Dympna mentioned, I'll be focusing on the main housing policies, plans and key organisations involved in the Irish housing system. So I'll be looking at how they interact with one another and the different roles they play in housing policy and delivery. I just want to provide a very brief explanation of what we mean by policy. So it includes government plans, legislation, regulation and codes of practice and governance. So there's a quote from a 2003 housing paper by Norris and Winston, which encapsulates this nicely. And they describe housing policy as any intervention by government designed to influence housing conditions. So just moving on to, just moving on to the overview and role of the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, or DHLGH as it's affectionately known as. So a lot of acronyms in housing, and this is the first one. So the current Minister for Housing is James Browne, TD, and he heads up this department. So the role of the department is to legislate on housing, planning and building standards. It also coordinates the activities of local authorities. There's a general supervisory function over the social, financial and technical aspects of social and private housing provision. There's also the important distribution of most of the capital funding and subsidies for housing provided by the state. However, it is a growing and vibrant sector with over €9 billion allocated to housing in the 2026 budget. So to put this figure into some context, this figure was around 691 million in 2012. So it's really grown since then. So while the department develops and implements housing policy, it is subject to parliamentary oversight by the Oireachtas, particularly through the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Housing, Local Government and Heritage. And they scrutinise policy and legislation and the expenditure as well, and they implement and make recommendations. So it's an important resource in housing policy, and I would encourage you to visit their site as well. So policy development and implementation, it doesn't just happen in a vacuum on its own. There are many external factors that impact and influence how and what kind of housing policy is prioritised and developed. So for the purposes of this webinar, we're going to look at some of the main factors that influence and shape Irish housing policy, particularly in the last few decades. So looking at the economic factors, so this includes how increasing construction costs have impacted viability in the housing sector and in turn the ability to build and deliver homes and their overall cost at the end as well. So budget setting and availability of state funds, as I mentioned in the previous slide, the €9 billion compared to the 2012 figure of €691 million impacts on what resources are available to deliver infrastructure services and homes. And there's also competing interests from other departments, the economic cycles as well. And as well as there's also a finite amount of land, which again can also impact on the cost to deliver homes in Ireland. So looking at demographics, so in the last, I suppose, kind of 1 to 2 decades, there's been a recognition of Ireland's growing and ageing population and what that means for future housing needs and delivery. So in the last census data, it was found that there were more adults living at home with their families and a smaller household formation as well. And that will influence the kind of homes that are built in the future. Social and cultural norms in Ireland also play an important part in shaping housing policy. In the past, this has meant that there are very high rates of home ownership, while more recently there's been a shift to more households and individuals living in the private rental sector and for longer as well. Legislation and policies that are already in place can impact current housing policy changes and development. There can be legacy issues, and it can be hard to change embedded legislation. It takes time, and there can be unintended consequences as well. So looking at key documents and housing plans, and you may hear these mentioned within your role and the workplace as well. So these also influence housing strategy and what work programs get prioritised and implemented as well. So looking at the most recent housing plan, Delivering Homes, Building Communities, this was published in November 2025 and replaces Housing for All. So it contains key actions across a spectrum of housing delivery and programmes, and it sets overall housing targets up to 2030. And in the next few slides, I'll go through in some more detail about what's in this housing plan. So next we have the National Planning Framework, and this is Ireland's National Spatial Strategy to 2040. So that just means that it involves the planned organisation of land, resources and activities to guide development and ensure a sustainable, functional and equitable use of space and land. So in this plan, you'll also find information on housing policy around compact growth and sustainable communities and how and where we build these homes. So hand in hand with the National Planning Framework is the National Development Plan, and this sets out the infrastructure services that is needed for these homes and communities. And so when we talk about infrastructure services, we mean water, electricity, energy, the roads, and they're all important for the development of homes as well. So Ireland's National Development Plan is the government's long-term plan for investing in the country's future. It aims to improve infrastructure and public services to support a growing population, a stronger economy and a better quality of life. So in the bottom left corner, we have the Social Housing Summary Assessment. And this is an annual point-in-time review of the social housing need in Ireland not currently being met. The Housing Agency leads on this report with support from local authorities. The Housing Agency compiles this information to understand the social housing need in each local authority and the profile of households on the waiting list. In the bottom middle, we have the report of the AHB Strategic Forum, also published in 2025. And this report sought feedback from AHBs and other key stakeholders and provides recommendations to strengthen the AHB sector to support the delivery of more social and affordable homes. Finally, we have the report of the Housing Commission. This was published in 2024. And the Housing Commission was established to take a long-term, independent look at Ireland's housing system. And its purpose was to advise the government on how Ireland could develop a sustainable housing system for future generations. This commission was made up of housing professionals and experts across various parts of the housing sector, including the private sector, AHBs, academia and research. So this report made 83 recommendations and approximately 350 supporting actions aimed at creating a more sustainable long-term housing system in Ireland. And it influenced the most recent Delivering Homes, Building Communities housing plan and is incited in a lot of the housing research as well. So moving on to the Delivering Homes, Building Communities 2025 to 2030 housing plan. So this is an action plan on housing supply and targeting homelessness. So this is the main housing plan for Irish policy and it replaces Housing for All. It sets out key overall delivery targets for housing, how this will be funded and financed, as well as the various measures to speed up and unlock housing delivery. It's a very action-focused housing plan as well, and is focused on the delivering of homes as quickly as possible. So this housing plan will impact the work of everyone who works in housing, and I would recommend that everyone reads through it to understand the department's priorities and roadmap for housing delivery until 2030. So looking at some of the actions in this plan, so we have pillar 1, which is activating supply. So this pillar focuses on activating land, delivering the infrastructure that is required to build homes in the first place. This is where the financing and funding that is required to deliver homes and communities, and where this will need to be sourced from, which is a mixture of state and private investment. Also talks about the importance of modern methods of construction and addressing vacancy and dereliction in Ireland. The second pillar, supporting people, focuses on people and communities, including ending homelessness, housing for older people, and social inclusion. So I mentioned earlier that one of the main influencing factors on housing currently and into the future is demographics and Ireland's ageing population. So there are strategies and accompanying actions to address this issue and ensure we have a suitable pipeline of homes that are suited to various stages of the life cycle. There's also a recognition of the need for more social housing, as well as affordable housing supports, particularly for first-time buyers. Investment in communities across Ireland, including in towns and cities and rural areas, is another key priority in this plan. So for this part of the webinar, I will be looking at the key organisations in the Irish housing system and how they interact with one another to deliver, support and regulate housing in Ireland. So this diagram here shows the various government departments and agencies that deliver, support and regulate the housing system in Ireland. It also shows how other departments in government contribute to the housing sector, key delivery partners such as infrastructure organisations, as well as the private sector, including developers and builders, and financing and lending institutions. They all have a part to play, and it is a complex system which can make housing policy implementation a tricky but interesting sector to work in. So I just wanted to bring your attention to this overall housing ecosystem and how it interacts. But for the purposes of this presentation, I would like to home in on the key organisations that deliver housing, support the delivery and provide regulation and assurance to the sector, which is on the next few slides. So looking at the key organisations in Irish housing and looking at housing delivery. And this includes local authorities, and they're delivering mixed tenure communities such as social, cost rental and affordable purchase. The Land Development Agency and approved housing bodies who work with local authorities to deliver social and cost rental housing in Ireland. Supporting organisations. So these are organisations that either support the delivery of homes but don't deliver directly, or they implement the policy and programmes that the Department of Housing has set out. These organisations include the Housing Agency, the Housing Finance Agency and the Local Government Management Agency. Finally, the organisations in the third box provide governance, regulation and assurance that the housing sector is fit for purpose, is protecting tenants and is delivering on their remit, as well as protecting state assets and funding. These organisations are the Approved Housing Body Regulatory Authority, or ABRA, the Residential Tenancies Board, or the RTB, and the Irish Council for Social Housing, or the ICSH. So looking at local authorities in Ireland, so they provide a broad range of housing services within their boundaries, and there are 31 local authorities in Ireland. And they are the main provider of social housing and the largest landlord in Ireland. They have approximately 157,000 social homes, which is nearly 70% of overall social housing stock in Ireland, with the rest being managed by AHBs. So local authorities have a housing services department, which is responsible for a broad range of services and activities, such as assessing households for social housing, emergency accommodation, housing assistance payment and rental accommodation support, as well as delivering social homes in line with housing need and demand in their local area. They're also responsible for the management and maintenance of their current social housing stock. So all planning permissions are overseen and reviewed by the local authority, and they prepare and implement housing development plans based on local need. So to deliver these homes and communities, local authorities work in partnership with approved housing bodies and private developers. They are also responsible for certain infrastructure services, such as roads, which are important for sustainable communities to be able to access amenities easily in their local area. So how do local authorities deliver housing? Well, there's a number of mechanisms through which they do this. So there's direct delivery. So the local authority develops homes on its own land, and that's the direct delivery of social and affordable housing. There's also through Part 5, which is part of planning legislation, and that allows the local authority to acquire up to 20% of residential developments for social housing purposes. There's also turnkey developments. So the local authority enters into an agreement with the developer and the homes are purchased before completion, and they are also for social and affordable housing. And there's also the public-private partnerships. So a private partner delivers the project and the completed homes are transferred to the local authority. So the Land Development Agency, or LDA, is also another key housing delivery agency in Ireland, and it was established in 2018. It was set up to deliver affordable homes on state land, and it does this through unlocking public land and utilising home building partnerships. The LDA delivers social, cost rental and affordable housing, as well as supporting with planning and delivery. Now, moving on to our third key housing delivery body in Ireland, and this is the Approved Housing Bodies, or AHBs. So they are independent, not-for-profit organisations that are approved under the Housing Miscellaneous Act 1992. There are approximately 425 registered AHBs managing, leasing or owning approximately 70,000 homes in Ireland. They are governed and regulated by ABRA and RTB, as well as the charities regulator. And they receive state funding to provide social, cost rental and affordable homes to those experiencing homelessness, those with a disability or older people, and those in social housing need and on the waiting list with their local authority. AHBs promote sustainable communities and neighbourhoods through tenancy engagement activities as well. So the social housing schemes and supports in Ireland are obviously have a lot more information and context to it. And my colleague Pam McCarthy, who is head of local authority and AHB services here at the Housing Agency, will be discussing this topic in more detail at next week's Housing Essentials webinar, which is taking place on Wednesday, the 8th of July. So I'd encourage you all to sign up and attend that session. It will be an important and informative one as well. So now we move on to organisations that are supporting the delivery of housing and housing policy in Ireland. So we have the Housing Agency, which is us, and we were established in 2012 as a state-funded housing body, supporting and working in partnership with the Department of Housing, AHBs and local authorities. We provide research and insights and share housing knowledge, implement housing policy and programmes as set out by the Department of Housing. We provide expertise and technical guidance to local authorities and approved housing bodies and promote social inclusion in housing delivery. So the Housing Finance Agency, or HFA, provides some of the finance for delivering social and cost rental homes in Ireland. So the HFA is a state-owned company that provides loan finance to local authorities, AHBs and educational institutions for social, affordable and student-specific accommodation. And the type of schemes that the HFA lends for is acquisitions or turnkey projects, new builds, retrofits and mortgage to rent. So now for this part of the webinar, we're moving on to the organisations that provide governance, regulation and quality assurance to the housing sector in Ireland. So the Approved Housing Bodies Regulatory Authority, or ABRA, is an independent statutory regulator whose job is to oversee and protect the housing assets provided or managed by AHBs. So it was established under the Regulation of Approved Housing Bodies Act 2019 and formally set up in February 2021. So ABRA sets the standards for governance, financial management, property and asset management and tenancy management and monitors compliance with these standards for AHBs. It also maintains the AHB register and can also conduct investigations if there are concerns about an AHB's operations and can cancel registration if non-compliant. So the Residential Tenancies Board, or RTB, is an independent statutory board responsible for regulating the rental housing sector. It was established under the Residential Tenancies Act 2004, which Kevin mentioned earlier in his presentation, and it's to oversee and support the rental market. So the RTB aims to support a fair, transparent and well-functioning rental sector for tenants, landlords and others involved in the Irish housing system. And this has become a lot more important and needed as the private rental sector has increased and grown in the last 2.5 decades in particular. Each year, the RTB registers new tenancies and landlords, including private and AHBs, and maintains this National Register database. This database can also provide important analysis and data on the number of landlords, their size and profiles, and who is entering and exiting the private rental market. The RTB also ensures that landlords comply with tenancy law and regulations, including tenancy registration, rent setting rules, rent pressure zones, and termination procedures. The RTB provides dispute resolution between tenants and landlords through mediation and, where necessary, adjudication. So we're on to our last slide here. Last but by no means least is the Irish Council for Social Housing. So the ICSH is a national social housing federation representing over 270 housing associations across Ireland. It represents a sector by acting as a national voice for housing associations in discussions with government and other stakeholders on housing policy and practice. The ICSH also promotes good practice, collaboration and information sharing, advice and guidance on social housing development, management and governance, as well as training and education services. So that's everything from me. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'll pass you back to Dympna for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Hayley. Can you hear me okay there? And thank you for Kevin. That was a daunting task for you to go through so much content, but you did it flawlessly. Yeah, no, it's great and very interesting. I know you can't get in too deep on everything, so we appreciate that. We're going to stop the recording there and get into a few of our questions.